The night Kelowna General's psychiatric ward went quiet was the night Mara Quentin decided it was going to stay that way. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet that settles over a building after midnight when the last visitor badge has been handed back and the elevator doors have stopped their steady opening and closing. This was the other kind. The kind that a person with the right training learns to read like weather. Pressure dropping before the storm, birds gone silent before the earthquake. The kind of quiet that has a source. Mara had been the charge nurse on Unit 4 West for 11 months. Before that, she had been a lot of things she didn't talk about anymore. Most of her colleagues assumed she was quiet because she was shy. Nurse Kowalchuk, who had worked the unit for 19 years, thought Mara was just one of those young women who hadn't quite figured herself out yet. "Give her a few more years," she'd told the unit manager once. "She'll either open up or she'll burn out. Neither of those things was going to happen." But Mara had never felt the need to correct that impression. She preferred it, actually. The beige cardigan, the flat shoes, the habit of standing slightly behind whoever was speaking, eyes down, clipboard pressed to her chest. It was a kind of camouflage she'd learned long before she'd learned it had a name. Unit 4 West was a secured psychiatric ward. Not maximum security, but not the kind of place you wandered into by accident either. The ward held 22 beds, a nurse's station behind tempered glass, a common room with furniture bolted to the floor, and a corridor that smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness that never quite left places where people were kept against their will, even for their own good. Tonight it held 20 patients. One of them was a man named Gerald Oakes. Gerald Oakes was 43 years old and had been admitted 6 days ago under a suicide risk hold that the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Anand Mehta, had since quietly revised in his notes to something considerably more complicated. Gerald Oakes had not come to 4 West because he was in danger. He had come to 4 West because he was dangerous. The distinction mattered, and it was the kind of distinction that didn't always make it into the briefing a charge nurse received on a Tuesday evening in November when she was picking up an extra shift. What Mara knew was this. Gerald Oakes was a former accountant from Penticton. He was calm and cooperative. He slept from 10 to 6 without interruption, and he was not to be approached without a second staff member present. The last part was flagged in his chart with a yellow notation that the previous charge nurse had added without explanation. What she didn't know, what nobody on the unit knew, because the people who did know had not communicated it through the proper channels, was that Gerald Oakes was the only living witness to a financial arrangement between a sitting provincial cabinet minister and a Vancouver-based contractor with significant connections to organized crime. Gerald Oakes had made a phone call 11 days ago. He had spoken to the wrong person about it. And the right people had decided that 6 days in a psychiatric unit in the Okanagan was more than enough time to find a solution. The solution arrived at 11:47 p.m. Mara noticed him first because of the shoes. She was at the nurse's station, updating medication logs, when she caught a flash of movement in her peripheral vision. The corridor door opening and a figure in green scrubs moving through it with purpose. Not unusual on its own. Staff moved through the unit at all hours. But the shoes were wrong. Orderlies on 4 West wore non-slip rubber-soled shoes, soft enough that you could hear the squeaking on linoleum before you heard the person. These shoes were dark leather, low heel, the kind of sole that was designed to be quiet on hard surfaces. She looked up. The man was tall, mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of unhurried confidence that either belonged to a very experienced clinician or to someone who had spent considerable time learning how to look like one. His ID badge was clipped to his breast pocket, but from this distance, Mara couldn't read the name. He was carrying a medication tray, a single small cup, and a syringe. "Can I help you?" Mara said. Her voice was the same voice she always used, calm, neutral, slightly deferential. The man looked at her without surprise. "Just a PRN order for Oakes in 412. Dr. Mehta called it in. I didn't see anything come through." "It might have gone to the overnight desk," he said. "I can check with pharmacy if there's a discrepancy. Won't take long." He said it the way people say things when they're confident you're going to let it go. Mara looked at the tray. The cup held 2 capsules, standard enough. The syringe was capped, unlabeled. Which pharmacy? He paused, just barely. A half-second flicker of recalibration that most people would not have clocked at all. Beg your pardon? Which pharmacy did the order come through? We used dispensary on 3 for PRNs after 10, and they would have sent it up through the pneumatic with documentation. She gestured at the empty tube receiver on the wall behind her. Nothing came through tonight. The man looked at the receiver. Then he looked at Mara. She had the clipboard in front of her, and she was looking at him with an expression of mild, bureaucratic patience. She had perfected that expression over years of being underestimated, and it had never been more useful than it was right now. There may have been a miscommunication, he said. Sure, Mara said. Why don't you head back down to dispensary and get the paperwork sorted? I'll let Dr. Mehta know you were here. She was already reaching for the phone. Something shifted behind his eyes. She had been watching for it, not the way most people watched for things, with their full attention, telegraphing their own alertness. She had been watching the way she'd been trained to watch, which was sideways and inward at the same time, keeping the larger picture in focus while tracking the details that didn't fit. The shoes, the unlabeled syringe, the timing, the confidence. All of it had been assembling itself into a shape she recognized, and now the shape was complete. She didn't call Dr. Mehta. Her left hand, resting flat on the desk, moved 3 inches to the right and pressed the silent alarm panel. One steady press. Then she lifted the phone with her right hand and dialed internal. Extension 221, she said clearly, for the benefit of anyone listening. The man in green scrubs watched her for 2 seconds. Then he said, "You're making a mistake." "I make them all the time," Mara said. "Have a good night." She turned back to her medication log. She did not watch him leave. She listened to the shoes on the linoleum, softer now, more deliberate, and tracked their direction, not back toward the corridor door he'd entered through. Left, toward the secondary hallway that ran past room 410, past room 412. She picked up the phone again. "Security," she said, when the desk answered. "Unit 4 West. I need a body at the North Corridor Junction right now. Don't announce." Then she came around the nurse's station, clipboard still in her arm, and followed. The North Corridor was darker than the main hall. Half the overhead lights were on an energy-saving cycle after 11, and the man in green scrubs was 30 feet ahead of her, moving quickly now. He dropped the performance. The tray was gone, left on a crash cart outside room 408, and his right hand was at his side, in a way that told Mara he was used to having something in it. Room 412 was at the end. She had approximately 90 seconds before he reached it, and she had 2 things he didn't know about. The first was that the North Corridor had a linen closet at the halfway point that could only be opened from the outside with a keycard. The second was her own particular history, which she kept folded up and stored away most of the time. The way you store a tool you don't use, often but maintain with care. She moved faster than she looked like she could move. By the time the man reached the linen closet, Mara was beside him. What happened next took about 4 seconds and would have been very difficult to describe in a report, which was why Mara was careful, later, about how she described it. She had not been trained in anything that had a clean institutional name. She had been trained in a different life, in the kind of close-quarters response that's designed for small spaces with no margin and no backup. The man was larger than her, and he had a weapon she hadn't confirmed yet, and both of those facts were relevant, but neither was decisive. What was decisive was positioning, timing, and the fact that he did not know she was. He was conscious. He would remain conscious throughout, but he was not going anywhere. Mara held him against the closet door and kept her voice very quiet. "The ward is on alert," she said. "Security is at the junction. There are 2 more points of egress, and both are covered. You have about 45 seconds before this hallway fills up, and your best outcome right now is being found by a nurse, not by the people who are going to come in behind security." She let that land. "Where is your ID badge from?" He said nothing. "I'm going to see it either way," she said. "I'm asking because I want to know whether someone on this ward gave you access, and if they did, that person needs help tonight too." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the recalibration of a professional who has encountered a variable they hadn't accounted for. It wasn't quite fear, it was something more useful than fear. "St. Paul's," he said finally. His voice was flat. "I used a St. Paul's badge. I came in through the physician's entrance at 9. Did anyone give it to you?" A pause. "No," Mara believed him. Not because she trusted him, but because the answer mattered to her professionally, and she was good at reading the difference. She released one hand and reached for her radio, when security arrived 40 seconds later. Two of them, both younger than her, both visibly unsure what they were walking into. They found Mara standing in the corridor with her clipboard, and a large man in green scrubs sitting on the floor against the linen closet with his hands visible and his face expressing something they couldn't quite name. He was attempting to access a patient room without documentation, Mara said. "I'd like someone to stay with him while I make a call, and I'd like someone else to check room 412 and confirm Mr. Oakes is settled." One of the security guards, his name tag said R. Boudreau, started to ask a question. Then he looked at the man on the floor. Then he looked at Mara. Then he stopped asking and did what she'd said. Mara walked back to the nurse's station and picked up the phone. Not the internal line. The direct line. She dialed a number she had not dialed in 11 months and had not deleted because she had known, in the part of herself that kept practical records, that there would eventually be a reason. It rang twice. "Quentin," said the voice on the other end. He sounded awake. He always sounded awake. "It's Mara. I'm at Kelowna General, Unit 4 West. I have a man in custody who came in on a St. Paul's credential and made an approach on your witness." She paused. "I'm going to need someone here inside 2 hours." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "You're sure about the credential?" He told me himself. He didn't have a reason to lie by that point, Mara. Another pause. "How long have you known Oakes was on that ward?" "About 40 minutes. She heard the man on the other end of the line exhale slowly through his nose. "You should have called before you went near him." "He was about to go through a patient's door with an unlabeled syringe," she said. "I didn't have time to convene a planning session." "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is Oakes?" "Gerald Oakes is asleep in room 412 and will remain so until morning." She straightened a form on the desks that didn't need straightening. "He had a 9 o'clock sedation. He doesn't know anything happened." A longer pause. Then, quietly, "You're still very good at this." "I'm a nurse," Mara said. "I'm good at that too. Are you sending someone?" 2 hours. Maybe less. "I'll be here." She hung up and sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows a thing like that, not relief exactly, and not the receding of adrenaline either, because her system had long ago learned to metabolize that before it became noise. More like the feeling of an equation that has balanced. A problem that has resolved into its correct answer. She had been careful, and the careful things had held. Through the tempered glass of the nurse's station, she could see R. Boudreau standing in the corridor outside room 412, back straight, not quite sure what he was guarding against, but doing it diligently anyway. She made a note to commend him in the morning report. She pulled up the medication logs and went back to work. At 12:14 a.m., the man in green scrubs, whose real name would not be disclosed to Mara, and who would be removed from the ward by 2 individuals who arrived in an unmarked SUV and identified themselves to security as federal officers, was taken from Unit 4 West in a way that generated almost no disruption to the ward's nighttime routine. At 1:40 a.m., a woman arrived on the unit. She was wearing a dark jacket and carrying a coffee she hadn't touched. She spoke to Mara for 22 minutes in the small family consultation room off the corridor, and at the end of those 22 minutes, she said, "We're going to move Oakes to a more secure location in the morning." Before rounds. "Can you make that work without alerting the ward?" Mara considered it. "I can list him as a transfer on the morning board. It won't raise questions if it's done before 6:30. "Good." The woman looked at her for a moment. "You know someone's going to ask how a charge nurse subdued a trained." "I assessed a confused visitor who appeared to be in medical distress," Mara said, "and I supported him in sitting down safely until security could assist. It's in my incident report." The woman looked at her for another moment. "It's good that you're here," she said. Mara didn't answer that. Some things didn't need answering. After the woman left, Mara made her 2 a.m. rounds. She moved through the ward the way she always moved through it, quietly, without urgency, stopping at each door for the right amount of time. The patients who were awake, the ones whose conditions made sleep unreliable, heard the familiar small sounds of her presence and settled. Mrs. Langford in room 406, who hadn't slept through the night in 3 weeks, was breathing evenly by the time Mara passed her door for the second time. At room 412, Mara paused. Gerald Oakes was asleep on his side, blanket pulled up, face slack, and unguarded in the way that sleeping faces are. He looked smaller than he did during the day. He didn't know how close it had come. He didn't know that someone had spent 11 months of their life becoming invisible in a place exactly like this one, and that the invisibility had been, in the end, the sharpest thing she owned. He would testify. That had already been decided by people much further up the chain than Mara. He would testify, and the testimony would matter, and whatever followed from it would follow from it. That wasn't her file. That had never been her file. Her file was this ward, these 22 beds, the 45 seconds in a north corridor, and the medication logs that still needed finishing before 6. She finished them. At 5:58 a.m., before the morning staff arrived, and before Boudreau's shift ended, and before the sun came up fully over the mountains east of the city, Mara Quentin stood at the nurse's station window and drank a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold and watched the sky go from black to gray to that particular shade of pale winter blue that Kelowna does better than almost anywhere. She had a shift review at 9. She had told the incoming charge nurse over the phone that it had been a quiet night. It had been, mostly. The rest of it was hers to keep.